Dual language learners, some of our viewers may not be familiar with the term. If you could tell me what DLL is and why knowing about that term is more important now than ever.
About a little bit more than 1 in 5 children in the U.S. Is a non-English speaker at home. So the reason why we use the term dual language learners is because they are simultaneously learning their home language and then eventually English acquisition. So they're learning English as well. So both of them. And the idea is that support of both languages is equally important as they're learning to switch from one language to the other. And that switch in itself is a skill. And that skill builds further knowledge and other skills further on in their life. So it strengthens other skills in their development.
You and your colleagues wrote a policy brief. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
The policy brief was intended to look a little bit about what population generally is looking at dual language learners. So this idea that we have about a little bit over 20% of the children in the United States are currently a dual language learner. That also how many of them are attending quality pre-K, that's about a third of them. And then at the same time it's looking about, well, if we have a growing population, how are state preschool programs serving them? And then so we are based on a survey and building on a national survey that we do of state pre-K programs. This yearbook also particularly looked at policies that had to do with serving dual language learners. So supports that we need to have there if we really want to make sure that we're supporting not only the home language, not only the English language, but also the home language. And what we found and was particularly important is that there is, if anything, a vast scarcity of support across the board in the United States. And really 9 out of 60 programs have some degree of good supports, and the majority of them really don't have supports, and many programs don't even know, don't screen, don't know who is a language learner, don't qualify them. So I think for a population that is increasing important, and in some states it's very large, I mean that is a problem that we wanted to highlight.
You had mentioned supports. Could you detail what some of those would be?
From a teacher perspective, a teacher doesn't necessarily need to be bilingual, but realistically, the majority of our preschool programs have English monolingual teachers. No? But it is important that they know what is the order in which an English learner, a dual language learner, acquires a new language, and how the transition happens. The potential for isolation, so the social-emotional support that is needed, and also how some skills from language translate to skills to another language, and how those build together. And in addition, knowing and able to have the supports from the district to be able to evaluate what knowledge a child might actually have, but not necessarily express it in English. So does the child know a concept, but doesn't know the word in English, for example? Does the child know how to do has certain abilities, but doesn't express them in English either? Because knowing a concept or having the ability versus not knowing to express it in English are two different things. And not being able to assess it or screen for those things are very important things that teacher must be able to do and have the supports to do.
Was that your survey that information is based on?
Only 9 state pre-K programs out of 60 have staff requirements of staff qualifications, and out of 60 state pre-K programs. So there's not every state has a state pre-K program, but there are states that have more than one. That's why we go to 60. No, so there's various states that don't have any pre-K programs, and then 60 state pre-K programs have any requirements about DLL, specific training for DLL, so that staff has to be trained in specific qualities. So only 6 out of the 60, so that's 10% of the programs that exist out there, really require that staff that are teaching in front of these children that are DLL have any training that is specific to DLL. So that's very limited. It's very few states. And you have states like Florida and Arizona that have a lot of children that are DLL that have very weak policies to support them, for example.
What are the benefits for school-aged kids when those supports are in place and when they're getting teachers who have the DLL training?
If you are able to maintain and equally support both languages, what happens is that children show a highly stronger cognitive development and skills, but they also show stronger social emotional skills, and they also have what the research has shown is that there's also higher executive functions, because having the ability to move from one language to another and artfully execute that and knowing when to use it in good ways, that and inhibit one saying, oh, I'm going to use this one, I need to use this one, this is when I need to move from this one to another, this vocabulary is the appropriate one to use, and for example, even more skillfully, my daughter now decides to translate because she wants to a whole song. Doing that, it's an executive function. It requires a lot of memory and attention and control. Those are executive functions that also predict a lot of further later development. So do we want our children to succeed, and do we want our language learners to succeed? And if we think that a lot of that population also comes from high poverty, if we want to give them a better chance to succeed in life, then even further. That's the whole purpose of providing the supports and this strengthening both languages.
What would you want parents to know, and what are some of the things that parents can keep in mind, especially if they are coming from a situation where there is more than one language spoken in the home?
There's many things that you can do in the home, and then things you can do with the school in partnership. So in the home, one thing that I always mind myself is that my children bring words from the school that I've never used, like whatever it be. Say that one day they decide to bring the word, I don't know, they learned that ant has an exoskeleton, and I'm like, I never in my life used that word. But I find the word in Spanish and I decide to use it for a particular reason. And I find a reason to use it in Spanish in the vocabulary that we have it at home. I do the same with songs, and now right now it's Halloween, so they bring a lot of Halloween songs, and I challenge them to translate them to Spanish with the same rhythm and music. So we do that. We do games in which they have to translate, and then we make it a competition in the house whether we can translate or not skillfully a song. And I try to make sure that I incorporate, because the more challenging the vocabulary becomes, that will challenge the home language, which, we're talking about dinner usually. We're not talking about things in science that they're learning at school. So the more we have to up the game at home. So it's being able to translate that and maintaining that level of engagement in the vocabulary, it's great. Then the other thing is, if you're able, coming into the school with the home language is also a good partnership with the school. So things I've done is I actually have come to the school and have done bilingual readings, in which we've read beginning when they're very little, a very simple book in Spanish and in English. And I've also taught 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds what bilingualism means, or multilingualism, so that even a monolingual child learns that's about having this differentiation between children that speak one language in some situations and speak another in other situations. So bringing that at home in partnership. And if you can do that with more than one parent, so in partnership, so that happens often in classrooms. So say that 5 of us in a classroom are Hispanic, or 5 of us are from other languages, and we all start bringing it into the classroom often, then you expose all the children in that classroom to the same kind of partnership. So it's bringing that into the school and make it part of their everyday life, so that in partnership in the school and in that home, you build both of those areas.
Why so critical now at this point that schools and policymakers start to really look at dual language learners?
The research has moved us from an understanding that this is not a deficit issue, that it's an asset. We have very clear understanding that having a second language and a home language that is different, and building both of them builds stronger children, and it's good for children. So it should never be seen as a deficit. And the fact that they come with a different language, but we disregard it and we let the home language disappear, then it becomes a deficit, because then it goes against their culture, and it might actually damage even their self-concept. So there are some studies that have shown that. So, but if we build them both together, then we have a stronger child with probably a higher cognitive abilities that he would have or she would have had, and then stronger executive functions, and a higher probability of having a stronger developmental path across all of that childhood and the whole schooling outcomes. So the goal is knowing that just having those supports will provide this child better outcomes. Why wouldn't we do that?
I want to touch a little bit on the Lieberman study on multilingual children. If you wouldn't mind telling me a little bit about that study on lingual children.
So this study by Lieberman and her colleagues, it's about looking at 64 babies, and just after their babies. Now it's 14 to 17 months, so in their second year of life. And half of them are from a monolingual environment and half of them are from a multilingual environment in different mixes, so different percentages. What we say about that is some of them are exposed to 30% of another language, some of them are exposed to 70% of the time to another language. So a variation of that multilingualism. So what they are looking for is this idea that in this multilingual environment, which is, the idea is there's a socialization that is different, and the fact that we're looking at this or they're looking at this idea that whether these children have the opportunity to develop what we call meta-linguistic awareness. So basically is being aware that different people use different ways of communicating. And that is awareness of language. So it would be the same whether they're different languages, multilingual, it would be the same whether they're using sign language. So all of those concepts all come together, but basically that there are different forms of communication happening around the baby. So based on that idea, they try an experiment in which they put an individual in front of the baby, and then the baby can see two objects that are the same, but the person that is in front of them only can see one of the two. Okay, so, and then the baby that is the 14 to 17-year-old month, so this is if you think about the baby where they are, this is a child already starting to have some words, already can respond to many of the commands, already probably walking, so he's responsive to many of the requests and starting to some verbal responses themselves. And then you can, the adult in front of them is asking them if they can have, for example, say you put a banana in front of them and the baby sees two bananas, but the adults only see one and say, oh, look at that, there's a banana, can I have the banana? So whether the baby has some perception that this adult in front of them is only able to see one of the two. So with that idea in mind, what they found is that children that are from multilingual homes are really more able to see that perception, perceive that the person in front of them is communicating about one banana that they can see, not the one that they cannot see. And they found the multilingual babies more consistently chose the one that the person in front of them can actually see, not the one that they couldn't see. So, and this with several objects, several repetitions. So they found that there's a perception of the communication process that happens with the adults that is in front of them, that is much more acute with babies that come from multilingual environments. And they found no difference depending on the variation of the exposure of language, so whether they were more or less exposure to a different language. So it didn't matter if it was 30% of another language or 50% of another language, or so it's any degree of multilingualism or bilingualism that made this difference in their findings.
So what does that suggest?
To a parent. So what happens is that any degree of exposure actually makes the child acute to look different people use different ways of communication and perceive that make them more acute at the needs and the perceptions of other people, so basically around them.
Is there anything I didn't ask you, either about the policy brief or about the Lieberman study, that you would want to make sure that people know?
I think if we want to also look at the larger policies that the programs and what they're doing for our children, when we're picking and choosing programs, we can see whether any supports exist, what is the communications plans for multilingual families, do they screen or any way for home language so that they know or try to understand what children know and the levels they have regardless of what language they speak on. to try to be inclusive of different languages. So I think as parents, we want to know what role and how much they will support the different languages that the children might bring in. And if we're monolingual, if I'm a monolingual family, I think understanding that exposure to all those children will actually benefit my child as well, because multilingualism itself will bring my child, make them more receptive, maybe more understanding. This idea of metalinguistic understand that there's different forms of language, and perceive that all of that benefits my child, because they'll understand that there are different forms of communication, and the different forms of communication makes them more acute to understanding and perceive perspective in different people. That as a monolingual child, that will also bring them benefit. I think that's good to understand from the other perspective. So that's also a good environment for my child, regardless of whether they're from an English or non-English environment.
What I will also ask you is just a little bit about your background, where you got your undergraduate degree, master's, advanced degrees.
I actually got my undergrad degree. It's a degree in Bachelor of Science in Economics, and I got that in Argentina. But then I got my master's degrees in education policy at Harvard, and then my PhD, I got it in economics and education at Columbia University.